Well, it looks to me like we've got a quorum. A few people might be trickling in as the minutes tick by. But without further ado, I'd like to get started. As I mentioned, my name is Nick Astor with South Pole, Director of Marketing for North America. Today's webinar, in partnership with CDP, is what we call a bite-sized webinar. That means this is something that's going to give you a lot of information real quick. We're only going to go for about 30 minutes and going to give you plenty of stuff to digest, take some notes, take home with you. The only downside is we're not going to have time for Q&A on today's webinar. However, if you're familiar with GoToWebinar, you do know that there is a questions and chat box on the right hand of your screen. Please don't hesitate to ask questions anyway. We will be collecting those questions and we'll incorporate that into some of the follow-up after today's webinar. Without further ado, it being bite-sized, my goal is to get us moving real quickly so we can turn this over to the presenters and have a terrific conversation today. Joanna, if you'd roll to the next slide. Ta-da, great. So today, I've already introduced myself. You're going to hear from Anna Moser. She's the Key Account Manager and Sustainability Advisor for the DACH region. That's the German-speaking region of South Pole. And Tom Bielefeld is Managing Consultant for Physical Risks. He's based in Amsterdam, and he'll be taking us through the second half of the webinar today. Vis-a-vis a real fast background of who we are. Next slide, please. South Pole is a full-service sustainability consultancy. We're based in Zurich, Switzerland, but we have offices all over the world, over 1,200 employees. We're also very well known as a carbon projects developer all over the world, both nature-based solutions and technological. And the next slide gives you a little bit of a picture for where we operate. If there's almost certainly somebody near you. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, on slide number 5, everything we do, we put into a concept we call the climate journey, which is essentially a pathway to help you understand your climate footprint, your climate risk, take action to reduce that climate risk, and ultimately evolve into a leader in this space. Today, we're going to be focusing on the first 2 segments of the climate journey, getting into how you go about starting to measure your climate footprint, understanding the concept of climate risk, what that means to you, and then how do you go about building a roadmap and setting targets to address that footprint and that risk. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it right over to Tom.
Most of you are already reporting on the CDP, but if not, here's an oversight of the 2023 climate change questionnaire from CDP. As you can see, this questionnaire consists of multiple chapters. And by participating in the questionnaire, you can show your commitment to environmental sustainability. During this webinar, we'll discuss 3 essential subjects that all feed into different chapters of CDP. Namely, how to manage your climate risks as first. Second of all, how to measure your GHG emissions. And third, how to set science-based targets and create a reduction roadmap. If you would have any other questions on different chapters of CDP, such as carbon pricing or biodiversity, you can reach out to us as well. Diving into the first subject, managing climate risks and opportunities. There are mainly 2 different types of climate risks and opportunities, physical and transition. Transition risks refer to the risks and opportunities that arise from the process of transitioning to a low carbon economy. There are 5 different categories of transition risk and opportunities. Policy and legal risks and opportunities, referring to the changes in government policies and regulations, such as carbon pricing. Technology risks and opportunities. These are associated with the adoption of new technologies and for the phasing out of existing technologies, such as the switch from fossil fuel-based vehicles to electric vehicles. Market risks and opportunities. These are associated with changes in market demand and supply, such as the decrease in demand of fossil fuels. And reputational risks and opportunities, and these are associated with the reputation of companies and the industries that are perceived as contributing to climate change. In order to analyze transition risk and opportunities, policy and regulatory frameworks, technological innovations, and market trends are analyzed under different transition scenarios and timeframes. An example of a transition risk already materialized happened in Poland in 2020, where a major Polish energy firm suspended the funding of the newest coal plant. And the reason for this was the rising carbon pricing and the plummeting costs of renewables threatened to make this plant a stranded asset. And original developers were forced to write down 1 billion Polish zlotys on their investments. Moving on to the other spectrum of risks and opportunities, physical risks and opportunities. These refer to the direct and indirect impacts of climate change and the environment, natural resources, and human systems. Examples of physical risks include more frequent and severe weather events, such as storms, floods, droughts, and heat waves. And these risks can have significant impacts on various sectors, including agriculture and infrastructure, and can result in large economic losses and social disruption. To be able to assess physical risks, you would have to model the future climate using physical climate scenarios. An example of an already materialized physical risk can be seen on the right with the 2018 California wildfires, which roughly destroyed 8,000 square kilometers of land. Insurance claims exceeded 11.4 billion. And the main reason of these wildfires were equipment failures in one of the largest utility providers within California. And not being able to afford the costs of these wildfires and claims, this utility provider filed for bankruptcy, and this led to potentially thousands of victims without compensation. Because of this, concerns regarding the future availability of home insurance has grown. And why this is a climate risk is that the lengthening of wildfires is projected to increase because of physical climate change. The Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures was established to encourage greater transparency on the financial risks and opportunities arising from physical and transition risks. The TCFD is considered the international best practice for climate risk and opportunity disclosure and other reporting standards, including CDP and DJSI, and upcoming regulations such as the FCA regulations in the UK, the SEC in the USA, and the EU taxonomy have aligned their approach with the TCFD. The TCFD is supported by 2,600 organizations globally that represent a market capitalization of 25 trillion. And finally, the TCFD encourages the incorporation of climate disclosures into mainstream financial statements to demonstrate your commitment to tackling climate issues and climate risks and opportunities. So why would you do and report under the TCFD? This has mainly 3 points. It encourages scenario analysis to assess and understand your climate-related risks and opportunities in the mid and long term. It encourages to quantify the financial risks arising from transition risks and opportunities and physical on your business. And it encourages to build a climate resilience strategy. So moving on to the first point of this, of the values as proposed by the TCFD, scenario analysis. Transition risk scenario analysis is done differently than physical. For transition risks and opportunity analysis, you would have to conduct detailed assessment of the 5 transition risk and opportunity category as proposed by the TCFD. You would have to draw upon different kinds of climate scenarios, such as the scenarios from the IPCC, the IEA, and the NGFS. You must consider regional, national, and sector-specific scenarios, projections, and plans. And that makes it also the key challenge of transition risk and opportunity assessment, is to find the sector specific scenario data that allows you to conduct transition risk and opportunity assessment. On the other side, you have physical risk and opportunity scenario analysis, where you draw almost all climate modeling groups use IPCC climate scenarios to model the future state of the climate. There are different modeling groups modeling different climate hazards, such as the NASA has modeled temperature changes, precipitation changes, and Paris Aqueduct has modeled flooding, and Climata is used for modeling tropical cyclones. So there are different data sources for different physical hazards. The main challenges for conducting physical risk assessment is the sheer size of the data sets, multiple terabytes, and the interpretation of the climate data itself, so the climate science feeding into the assessments. Moving on from scenario analysis to how do you quantify a transition physical or physical risk. For this, we use a consistent framework introduced by the IPCC and aligned with the TCFD. It combines hazard, exposure, and vulnerability to define the impacts arising from the physical and transition risks. For the hazard is reflected, or for the hazard, to define the hazard, we use climate scenario data. The exposure is defined by the geographical dependency of your company, so where are you located? And the vulnerability is defined by company-specific info, so the number of workers or the revenue per factory. And we combine this by South Pole expert knowledge on how things would impact your business. And finally, the third one is how to build a climate resilient strategy. And the climate resilient strategy is combined of two components, mitigation and adaptation, where adaptation increases your climate resilience, building your ability to anticipate, manage, and recover from climate change, and mitigation by reducing, so you can include mitigation by reducing your contribution to climate change. And this is also a nice bridge to the next topic, which is GHG accounting, where they will focus on, and science-based targets, of course, where they will focus on the mitigation part of things. Thanks for listening.
Many thanks, Tom. So we have heard about climate risks and opportunities for your organization, an important part of a holistic climate strategy. Equally important, or even the most important step, but maybe I'm a bit biased here, is to think about what you as a company can do about those risks. So this leads me to the next two parts of the webinar, mapping your greenhouse gas footprint and setting targets. Endeavors that aim at bringing down your carbon footprint over time. So this one, on the one hand, helps you reduce your contribution to climate change, but on the other hand, and linking into what Tom just said, also directly helps you to mitigate your transition risks. So let's start with measuring your emissions with a greenhouse gas footprint. We're already on the right slide. Thanks, Joanna. In terms of measuring your footprint, first of all, that means understanding your emissions and quantifying them. And this is done with a greenhouse gas inventory, which is not only the basis to understand your footprint, but it's also required by the Science-Based Target Initiative. I will touch upon the Science-Based Target Initiative later on, but concretely, the Science-Based Target Initiatives asks the companies that their greenhouse gas inventory is in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so to say, gives you the rules on how to account for your emissions. It was launched in 1998 already by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council, and as said, defines the rules for your accounting. Now on the slide, we can see the breakdown of emissions in different scopes as given by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, depending on where in the value chain those emissions occur. For the sake of time, it is a bite-sized webinar. I won't go into too much detail here, but broadly said, scope 1 covers all your direct emissions occurring from sources that you directly own or control. And then scope 2 and 3 covers the indirect emission. Scope 2 thereby accounts for energy-related emissions, for example, from the generation of purchased electricity, steam, or heat. And Scope 3, last but not least, I say last but not least because it's often a very big bulk of the emissions, accounts for the emissions in your supply chain, both up and downstream. So with that, on to the next slide. You might want to ask, why should you measure your footprint? There is a great deal of importance, I would say, to greenhouse gas accounting, even though it is often not the most sexiest subject in the room. So why? I would say the first reason is a simple one. In order to kickstart your climate journey that Nick mentioned in the beginning, or to kickstart any climate action, this is where you need to begin. Or in other words, greenhouse gas accounting is basically your basis for everything that follows. The most important argument, though, I would say that there is business goals served by a greenhouse gas accounting, and I briefly want to touch upon 3 of those goals. First, greenhouse gas accounting improves your strategic decision making. By knowing your emissions, and most importantly by knowing your emissions hotspots, meaning where the bulk of your emission lie, that helps you make informed decisions, which in many cases, and I will touch upon it later, also helps you reduce costs. A second reason, greenhouse gas accounting does help you meet growing mandatory reporting requirements. We've already touched upon this as well. This is the second point, and I think one of the most important points. Measuring your footprint does help you future-proof your business, as it enables you, so to say, to credibly report to stakeholders under recognized frameworks such as the CDP, but also the GRI or the upcoming CSRD requirements. And last but not least, briefly, it does enhance brand awareness as transparent communication and disclosure of the measures you are taking help build reputation and enhance your employee and stakeholder confidence. All right. Now, when we look a bit deeper into the before mentioned greenhouse gas protocol, we don't get around the greenhouse gas protocol principles. And what they do say is basically, you should be relevant, it should be complete, it should be consistent, and it should be accurate. Many of you might have seen those criteria, those principles before. So what I would like to do is to briefly go into the detail of one of the most important principles, or actually one of the principles that we see as the most challenging one when we work together with company. And this is the principle of accuracy. Accuracy touches upon the problem of let's say, uncertainty in your calculations, because in the end of the day, we are measuring something, the greenhouse gas that is not visible to the naked eye, and hence there will always be some uncertainty. There is, however, the need to be very vigilant, to be as granular and as scientifically accurate as possible in your data collection, in your calculation, in your analysis, and also in your reporting. As a consulting company that offers greenhouse gas accounting, we do see that especially the data collection and the data cleaning steps take up the most time and prove to be the most challenging phase during a mandate, and not, as you would think, the actual analysis later on. So in the end, being more accurate also means moving from secondary data sources to primary data sources over time. And what does that mean concretely? I will explain briefly on the next slide. As you can see, Joanna, next slide, please. As you can see on the very left, when we work with data, there is 2 types of data. Primary data, which is the actual consumption data provided by you as a company or by your suppliers as well. So for example, energy consumption for fuel, when you are looking at fuel consumption purchased, or also electricity bills for purchased electricity. And if you already think now, ooh, that is going to be challenging, we don't have that data available, or we don't have it in our systems, don't worry. Very often companies don't have primary data available, especially in their first year of greenhouse gas accounting. And what then comes into play is secondary data. When it comes to secondary data, this includes anything from industry or national average data and statistics, but also spend-based data. And of course, companies like Southpole can help you navigate on this journey from secondary to primary data. All right. After we have now heard how to measure your footprint, onto the next slide, the logic next step is to set ambitious reduction targets to reduce the identified emissions. And this is where science-based targets come in. Before we dive into science-based targets and what they are, I'll quickly give you a brief introduction of the initiative behind it, the Science-Based Target Initiative. It was founded a while ago already as well, in 2015, as a collaboration of the 4 organizations you see on the slide here: CDP, the World Resource Institute, the UNGC, and as well the WWF. And the aim of the initiative is to drive ambitious climate action in the private sector by enabling companies such as you to set emission reduction targets based on science and consistent with the goal of the Paris Agreement. In detail, those science-based targets are short and medium-term emission reduction targets that are in line with the decarbonization needed to limit global warming to within 1.5 degrees. That's an important number, 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. One can definitely say that science-based targets are not or are no longer considered as a nice to have, but are considered as a key part of a well-considered and ambitious climate strategy. This is also proved, and you can see it in the graphic on the bottom, by over 4,000 companies who have already joined the initiative, and about half of those have actually committed to align their reduction in line with the 1.5 degree future. And last but not least, I want to mention regulations. It comes up again and again, such as the European Sustainable Reporting Directive, the CSRD, do create a push as well for science-based targets, but more on that on the next slide. Again, why you should set science-based targets. Summarized, I'd argue they're a clear-cut way to demonstrate that you are taking best-in-class action, but what is in for you as a company apart from that? I see 3 main reasons. First of all, setting science-based targets strengthens your standing in the market. This with a similar argument as for the greenhouse gas accounting, as it strengthens your brand reputation, but also science-based targets boost your investor confidence. I think that is an important argument, as it's not only customers that use sustainability as a benchmark nowadays of business credibility, but also investors. And investors are increasingly taking interest in the business environmental policies as they look to shore up their investments for the future. Then a second reason why to set science-based targets, savings, a bit of an unusual one. While a frequently heard argument is that greening your business model comes at a high cost, companies that are looking into setting science-based targets are proving this wrong. We do see that almost a third of the companies are already seeing bottom line savings thanks to their actions with setting science-based targets. Why this is, I think because by setting science-based targets, companies are ensuring that their operations remain lean and efficient, and are building resilience also against the future where, for example, resources such as resources derived from fossil fuels are becoming increasingly scarce and expensive. And last but not least, and I can't mention this enough, a science-based target also does help you get ahead of future regulations, or in other words, help you anticipate any regulatory policy or market development. And this in turn helps you mitigate the transition risks Tom mentioned before. And as national governments continue to work to implement the Paris agreements, I would say, and as they are ratcheting up their pledges towards their national country level goals, this argument will only grow in importance as we can expect to see more and more regulation to curb down the emissions. I'll make it short as we run out of time already. For the next slide, we have listed the most important requirements in order to make sure that companies stay in line with the 1.5 scenario. This SBTi has defined those set of criteria. The latest set of criteria, which those criteria also drawn from, has been released actually just last week on the 11th of April. Briefly touching upon it, boundary and scope as one of the requirements. Science-based targets have to cover company-wide scope 1 and 2 emissions. However, an important note here, the Science Based Target Initiative does require your company to do a Scope 3 screening. And if the screening shows that over 40% of your emissions lie in Scope 3, then also a Scope 3 target is required. Maybe worth also to note here is the threshold. 5% of Scope 1 and 2 emissions can be excluded as a maximum, so meaning the threshold of emissions needed to be covered in your science-based targets lies at 95%. Then time frame, we already briefly touched upon it as well. The long-term goal, of course, is to reach net zero by 2050, but there is a criteria to set yourself 5 to 10 year near-term targets, and this is, so to say, to make sure that you as a company are reducing direct and indirect emissions at the pace needed to reach the long-term goal of net zero by 2050. And then the two last ones before we finish, the target setting approach and method. This is a very complicated one, and for the sake of time, I will not go into too many details here, but basically there is two approaches you can choose from, the absolute and the intensity targets, whereas we often see that the company's growth ambition as well as your company's sector actually are the most important drivers of the target choice. Yeah, as mentioned, it is most often the most complex part of a target setting exercise and does take up the most time, so plan for it. And then last but not least, level of ambition. I think we talked about it. It's 1.5 degrees, actually only for Scope 1 and 2, but we want to mention here that even for Scope 3, we usually do recommend setting 1.5 degree targets. How this could look like, just for you as an overview on the next slide and setting all these pieces together. On the next slide, you can see a target formulation. For example, company XYZ commits to reduce their absolute Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions 42% by 2030 from a 2021 base year. With this, I'm already at the end, and I would like to hand back to Nick for the wrap-up.
Thanks so much, and thanks very much to Tom as well. Just to summarize here, we really focused on three major components of your climate journey: understanding that footprint, how do you measure it, how big is it, what are its components, and understanding how it, trying to build some kind of a roadmap or a path based ideally on science-based targets to reduce that footprint, and then of course understanding the concept of climate risk, how it applies to you and your operations. So I think we actually fit this perfectly in 30 minutes. I'm kind of pleased by that. Tom, if you want to pop on, Anya, if you want to pop on, we'll just give everybody a nice thank you. As I mentioned, please, if you do have any last minute questions, we got a bunch that came in the box. We'll do our best to address those questions in a follow-up email that you'll be getting. We'll also include a recording of this if you want to share it with colleagues. And then finally, of course, South Pole is very well equipped to help you get started with this climate journey. It would address any of the issues that we mentioned today in today's webinar. Please do be in touch. You can always drop us a line at info@southpole.com or visit our website for a lot more information.